There are principles that you can learn through stories that you don't have to go through hard knocks, that school of hard knocks, and you don't have to experience it yourself. Like, for instance, you don't have to go eat some manure to realize that's probably not going to taste good. So,
yeah. Welcome to Mosaic Minds, the podcast where every episode is a colorful blend of perspectives, ideas, and conversation. Each week, our diverse team of hosts brings their unique backgrounds, experiences, and interests to the table. Mosaic Minds is your invitation to join the conversation to see the world through a kaleidoscope of viewpoints. So grab a seat, tune in, and let the mosaic unfold before you. Welcome to another episode of Mosaic Minds Podcast. My name's Nick, and to my left here is Jason. And today our topic is going to be about storytelling and the benefits of it in everyday life along with in business. And to help us with that, our guest today is Brigham Blackham. Brigham, he has a rich background as a success coach, a podcast host, and former teacher. He interviews top entrepreneurs and leaders to share insights on building success, often exploring the importance of progress over perfection, and offering actionable advice for overcoming obstacles. Alongside his podcast, Brigham specializes in short-term real estate, kind of like Airbnb,
VRBO types of prop. Yeah.
He's the author of Leveling Up, which is also the name of the podcast. A lot of his work that he does with his clients is teaching them storytelling, and that's the way you get across, because obviously there's so much power in a story. So that's kind of what our topic's going to be about today. So if you could just kind of tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, where you started, how you got to where you are, and that kind of thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you first, Nick and Jason, for having me on this Mosaic podcast. It's so much fun to be able to be on here with Mosaic Minds. When I first got introduced to theater, this was when I was a little kid. I was probably in 6th, 7th grade. And I had this idea that, theater's kind of challenging. But when I got into it, man, storytelling just came so naturally to me. It was a way that I could connect with an audience. It was a way that I could connect with people. And you make friends when you're telling stories like you don't in almost any other way. So I remember first starting off as a professional actor. That was what I wanted to do for almost 10 years straight, going through college, going through all these different elements of life. I was focusing on growing my acting chops. How do I become a more articulate speaker? How do I make sure that I can have all these different beats in the story come together so that the audience will be drawn in, that they will be excited and engaged? And I realized that the better you can tell a story, the easier it is for your audience to connect with you, to relate with you, and the more important it is to let them see what's possible, because storytelling helps us tap into our imagination. And I think that's one of the biggest things with becoming a genius in anything that you want to do in business or in life. And being able to tell a great story is a huge part of that. So my start to my story was when I was in teaching Mandarin Chinese and theater in high school. I loved teaching theater, loved connecting with these kids and helping them use these different language models that I'd been studying for years to help them create progress. And as I started doing that, I was like, man, there's a lot more applications to storytelling than just in the classroom, in just learning Mandarin. There's so many ways that you can apply it to marketing. There's ways that you can apply it to your mindset. Because if you think about it, a lot of us, if we have stories that are not great programs that we run in our head, we start to think some really negative thoughts. We start to have some really frustrating things happen. But if we can adjust the version of our story that we want to tell ourselves, and we want to tell the people in our business and as we're creating our personal brand, suddenly those stories can start to live on. Those stories can start to step into ways that you can connect with an audience. And as I stepped into being a storytelling strategist, it came in A few different ways. The first way was as a short-term rental host. So I have now 9 properties on Airbnb, VRBO. I started out doing those properties because I was like, this is basically about as interactive of a version of real estate investing as there is. You get to tell a story and set an experience for a guest. Because it's not just coming and sleeping in a hotel room. You want to make sure that they have all their needs met. They have a beautiful place to stay. It feels comfortable. It makes them feel welcome. And then the entire customer journey is a story that you're helping them create. And as I started going through this process of taking my theater background, my language background, my short-term rental background, I was like, I wonder if I could help more people by sharing how to relate stories. And as I've been doing that, it starts to show that when you are like a podcast host, Nick and Jason, you'll definitely attest to this, the more progress that you can recognize and the more stories that are successful ways of doing things that you can see, the easier it is for you to turn decades into days. And those stories often boil down into a principle, and those principles will start to make it so that you can help your audience soar. And that's why I'm so passionate about storytelling, is because there are principles that you can learn through stories that you don't have to go through Hard Knocks, that school of hard knocks, and you don't have to experience it yourself. Like, for instance, you don't have to go eat some manure to realize that's probably not going to taste good. So you can absolutely get those experiences shared from a mentor, from a coach, from different people, and you can use storytelling in so many different aspects. So thank you for the question. I hope there's a little bit of a background in why I love storytelling. No, that's set a good precedent for us.
That's perfect, and I've always loved the idea of the importance of storytelling. So let me ask you this. If you were to pick, obviously it all goes together to form the story, but if you were to pick one thing, whether it be like tonality or the intro or whatever it might be, what would you say that the number one important thing to telling a good story would be? Not writing it, but telling a good story.
Telling a good story, it comes down to, does that story connect with your audience? Does it evoke emotion? In theater, there's an idea called catharsis. This comes literally thousands of years ago. The whole reason that you had the great tragedies that were going on was so that people could go and purge their emotions and experience that story, that tragedy. When you have a great story, it brings your audience in. It lets them feel what you felt. And you relive that story. You don't just relate that story. I think that's one of the key elements to an amazing story, is you feel it. You don't just hear it, you feel it. That's the way for a story to really land. So are you evoking emotion? Are you relating it in a way that lets your audience see it, feel it, touch it? And that's so important.
To pay you a compliment, the first word out of your mouth, 10 seconds in, you're already passionate about it. You're feeling it. You're animated. You're coming alive in that story. I can see why you would thrive under that. So to share about a minute story with you just real quick.
Sure.
My senior year, something changed my life. I was in a small basketball gym. I made a buzzer beater to win a game, right?
Oh, nice.
That changed my life because you could see and feel the raw emotion. So when I ask you to take a canvas with a blank canvas, let's just say the white figure behind you, and you start to paint out that story, or you tell the story, why tell story A over story B or C in your mind? What really resonates? And, you snap that finger and you're going to tell story A. How does that look for you? How does it sound from there?
That's a great question. Anytime in business or in life you're telling a story, you have to figure out, who am I telling the story to? For instance, I have 4 little kids, and if I'm going to be sharing a story from my past, it's going to be tailored with the language I use, the emotional quality that I use, the intensity of my voice to that audience. So you have to first figure out, who is it that I'm speaking to? What is my audience? And then how can I best make sure that this story is a version that they will, 1, understand, and 2, connect with. Because if they don't understand and they don't connect with it, why are you telling the story? It's just empty air. It's just empty words. So that would be my suggestion. Who are you speaking to? And then once you understand who you're speaking to, I think that next element is what is the best way to make that story come alive for them. There's a lot of frameworks you can use. You can use episodic style of telling your story. You can use narrative style. But figuring out what's the way that's going to best impact that person.
How do you determine normally, what's your best way to determine your crowd or determine your audience? I mean, like, okay, so how do I determine what kind of audience this is so that I know what kind of story to present them? Because like you said, you need to know who your audience is in order to connect with them. So let's say you were speaking to more than one person, or maybe like a small group of people. How would you ask them some questions first, or like how would you determine who your audience was?
So this is a great little tip. This is a speaker tip. This is a trainer tip. When you're starting off any story, when you're starting off any speech, you want to do a few poll questions or engagement questions. Here's a way you could say, how many of you have ever experienced X, Y, or Z? And you'll get a handful of people say, oh, I've experienced that. Maybe if you're talking about Jason, how many of you have ever made the game-winning shot? And they're like, oh, I've won that. What was that like for you? Can you go back there in your mind? You're like, yeah, that was amazing. Or how many of you have lost a game because somebody else made a game-winning shot? And they're like, oh, how did that feel? Let me tell you a story about when that happened to me in high school. Now you framed the story, you brought in a connection, and they're engaged. And like, well, I want to hear how you experienced that. That type of a hook is basically a frame. And when you have a framework, all frameworks have limits. As you're playing in those boundaries, you're giving them a context to see where that story fits and how it relates to them. Here's another way to think about this. Let's say, Nick, you are wanting to talk to your kids. You'd say, all right, they're having this struggle at school with bullies. You look back in your life, what's a significant moment where you were able to help somebody overcome a bullying issue? You found that story, and you're like, all right, hey kids, how have you been experiencing school? What are some of the things that's been going on? You hear that framework of how they're getting bullied, and then you say, is it all right? You're getting permission. Is it all right if I share an experience how I dealt with a bully? You're like, yeah, let's hear it. Once you gave that framework, then you can tie that story and fit it in that framework. You're not going to share all of the details. You're going to share everything that fits in that little framework. Does that make sense, Nick?
Yeah.
Excellent.
So you found the foundation of, you've determined your audience. Now, do you already... So I'm assuming you're pulling something from your memory, like you were saying, like in the example with the kids. So you got the foundation, you figured out your audience. At that point, do you tailor the way you tell the story, or is it just based on which story you would tell?
Have you ever been to a stand-up comedy gig, Nick? Have you ever done that before?
Yeah.
Every time a stand-up comic delivers their set, an integral part of that set is how the audience responds. If, for instance,
absolutely.
a joke doesn't land, he's not going to hit the third, fourth, fifth punchline off of that. He's going to go to the next joke.
Right.
Same thing with your story. If you say something and you get crickets, or you get people like, oh, I can't believe you said that, you'll read your audience, and how well you read your audience and how they respond to what things you brought up will determine whether or not you're going to add more or you're going to come back and redirect. I'm sure you guys have experienced this when you share a story and then you're like, oh, that didn't land, or that didn't make sense to them.
Yeah.
It's very common. Everybody sometimes lays an egg. When you do, you can either make fun of the story, right? That's something you can do. Or you can say, well, I guess I need to rethink how I told that. And it's okay. It's a learning experience. In storytelling, especially in business, you look at any advertisement. There's a story behind why they're saying what they're saying. And one of the reasons why I love storytelling in business is if you can clearly articulate the challenge that someone's experiencing, the problem, and articulate it so clearly that they can see it, they can feel it, they can touch it, they can smell it. They know, oh, that's a problem I have too, or that I will have soon. I want that solution. You don't even have to say what the solution is, and they'll already assume that you know how to solve it. because you understand their problem. They will have that buy-in. They're like, oh my goodness, I understand you. I feel you. I see you. I feel heard and seen because you understand me so well. That's the power of great storytelling in your copy. That's the power of great storytelling in, like, say, your podcast. As you're sharing those stories, the easier it is for people to connect with the guests, the easier it is for your people to want to share that episode with more people.
Yeah.
So the name of your podcast is Levelin Up Podcast, and I think it's interesting the variety of guests that you have, which is kind of what we call a mosaic, right? It kind of merges in the middle. You're not talking about specific topics. So if I draw a baseline right here, right, and I know you probably feel the same way that 6 months ago you're better today than you were 6 months ago.
Absolutely.
I also want to say that you're diversified in your skill set because you're bringing in, your theater background, the animation, the inflection, the tone, all of which you do very well, by the way. How do you fight that, lack of a better term, personal best plateau here and continue to level yourself up while edifying and leveling up your guest? How does those kind of merge in the middle for you?
That's beautiful. So if I'm going to simplify your question, how do I progress and how do I help my guests feel like they're progressing? Is that fair? Okay.
Spot on.
One of the ways that I've been able to progress consistently is I look at what is the best way that I can protect myself in the podcast by being prepared. The more I understand what that guest has done, how I can connect with them, and the better questions I have, the easier it is for me to engage with them. And then I lean into curiosity. I would much rather be curious than to be perfectly phrased in any of my questions. Because a lot of times when you are actually curious and you go down that path of imagination with them and you dig into their story and you find what those experiences are, it's almost like you're able to get to a place that you can't prepare for. And I love those happy little accidents. If we get those little Bob Ross moments, right?
So just talking about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So making sure that you are prepared for one, like actually know who you're letting on your podcast or who you're letting into your space. I vet my people. I typically will have a conversation with them once or twice before I let them on my podcast. And then they send me, their background. I connect that. Sometimes I'll even use ChatGPT to find some other sources. I could watch a podcast they were on or
I do that
connect with them in different ways. So one is being prepared and then be curious. And one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of my guests, they will share a few things with me that I'm like, whoa, I want to read that book or I want to connect with that person. And as I go down that rabbit hole, sometimes I learn things that I never would have thought about because I wasn't originally curious about it. Curiosity on the podcast led to more curiosity. Here's an example of that. I had Sharon Lecter on my podcast 2 weeks ago. She's the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad with Robert Kiyosaki and 3 Feet from Gold. And I was like, I've never read 3 Feet from Gold. I've heard that story so many different times. It's all about perseverance and not giving up when you're just about to hit that point of that breakthrough. And I read that book, and as I was reading it, I was like, I wonder if I could connect with that author as well. Because Sharon Lecter was the co-author. I was like, I've never met Greg Reed, but I'm gonna see if I can connect with him. And because I had Sharon on going to be on my podcast, it gave me a connection. And he's like, yeah, let's get on the podcast. So I'm gonna have him on in probably 2 or 3 months. So he said, as soon as this season's up, we're gonna get on. And I was like, that's awesome. So sometimes being brave to go for the A-list people and ask them to come onto the podcast.
Absolutely right.
So true.
It's something that you're like, hey, I talked to this person. I wonder if I could talk to that next one. And then I'm sure, connecting with Greg, now I'm going to have somebody else that he's either co-authored a book or been on a podcast with. And I just like being curiosity and making those connections. That's how I've leveled up my business in the podcast. And just, you never know who's going to say yes, so you might as well ask. It's already a no if you don't ask.
Yeah, that's
so
kind of our motto. Yeah.
To me, it's
Absolutely.
a stock reference, but you have a diversified portfolio. The story I'm going to tell you just real quick, it's profound to me. I was at a fishing tournament, right? We're staying in an Airbnb. We don't want to stay in that cookie cutter hotel. Well, come to find out, we were 30 miles from the Kentucky Derby. So you probably know what I'm going to say. I was very comfortable. I'm just changing my line of the pole. If you want to know the truth, give me give me a couch. I could care less if you have any paintings, but it was set up like I was going to the Derby. You know, cool. the plates were horses, the artwork was horses, the setup, the ambiance just remind me of, hey, I'm going to walk right outside and watch that horse race. So I think where I'm going with that transition there and segue into it, what do you get the most passionate about? What topic do you like to bleed through the microphone and just kind of really be amped up and animated and excited? What's that maybe one topic that gets you really excited in your talking podcast portfolio?
Okay. We're talking storytelling, and the reason why I love storytelling is it was the thing that helped me break through and be able to speak multiple languages. So I love talking language acquisition. I love talking learning methods. I know some people are like, oh, that's such a dorky topic, but I was a teacher and I don't care. I love it, and it's so much fun because when you are able to codify certain ways that you can learn and you can recognize those patterns, suddenly you can apply those patterns to any topic you want to. I applied language learning methodologies to learn how to memorize faster. That helped me in my acting career. I learned how to retain with using associations. That helped me be able to take a speech. And honestly, the last 7 times I've given a speech, I've not used my notes at all because I know how to create mind maps. So that's one way to organize your information, and then simplify it into main points. Simplify it to a way that you can share those insights and ideas based on your feelings and your key words rather than trying to be word for word. And that was so freeing for me. So being able to find those language models, being able to find ways that you can connect with people in how you learn, and then creating associations, reassociations, all of that. I love it. It's so much fun. So I have a great Genius in 21 Days program that talks about all the different methodologies of how to learn. But that's something I love to experience. So did that answer your question? I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole if you want to.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. It's funny that you brought that up about the language because that was one of the things I was going to ask about. So I can't think of the name of the company. I want to say like Kid IQ or IQ Kid or Q Kid, maybe something like that. But it's an ESL thing that you do, and you teach someone that maybe doesn't speak any English how to speak English, even though I don't speak their language. And the way that you do it is through storytelling and overemphasizing and acting and that kind of thing. You know, like soccer. You know what I mean? Like soccer. You know, something like that. You know, and I couldn't do it for too long because I felt. I mean, I'm sorry, but I just felt so cheesy because it was so over the top. But I mean, if I knew a little bit of the language, but for all I know, they're talking to their parents when they're in the back seat of the car, and they're like, "Who is this dumb American?" You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know, but. But yeah, is that kind of what you're talking about? I'm sure that had to help you when you were teaching a foreign language, was, you know, being able to just, you know, articulate so well with your body language and your tonality.
So let's go here for just a moment. When you are learning a language, the most important thing you can do is to provide context. If you don't have context, most of the time the words will go in one ear and out the other. Even in English, sometimes, if you don't know the context of a conversation, you may understand the words, but you don't know what is going on. If you can have a very clear context in language learning, you can go very deep and you can understand. And the key is to understand and figure out what's the story or the message that's being communicated. So one of the reasons why that comprehensible input works, like what Nick was talking about, you grab a physical object or a manipulative, some physical thing that allows the other person to see what you're talking about. You can contextualize what you're talking about by indicating things, pointing, making facial gestures and physical gestures, those different expressions. And it all comes down to making sure, do they know what I'm trying to communicate? And if they don't, do you have a way to circumnavigate, or circumlocution is what the actual word is. You circumvent that thing, you go all the way around until they figure out, oh, that's what you're trying to communicate. If you have a clear context, and a story is one of the best contexts you can have, then you can hit all of these different bullet points along the story. And instead of only memorizing 1 or 2 words, now all of those points are interconnected. And you're creating a way to remember those. And that's one of the reasons why when you are learning with a story and you have that clear framework and context, it makes it easier for those that are wanting to learn to be able to recall it. If you've ever been in a language class, I'll bet many of you went to high school and you're like, hey, am I just going to memorize this grammar tree? Rarely, if ever, will you remember anything from that. Nick or Jason, did you guys go to
I took
Spanish
4
class
years
or
of French, and I took 4 years of French, and which a lot of good it does.
Yeah.
You know, all the French immigrants coming in. You know what I mean? But like I took 4 years of French, and I could probably ask where the bathroom was. Maybe, you know, I could say
Great.
I could be cordial, but I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember most of it.
Here's one of the sad things about that. That's not an uncommon story. People spend years working on the language, but they don't contextualize it within a meaningful story. They don't give themselves reasons to recall it, and then they don't share what they learn. One of the ways that I've found success in learning a language, because I speak Mandarin, I speak Spanish. I'm learning French right now and ASL alongside it.
Oh, cool. That's very cool.
It comes down to, are you able to understand? Yes, you have to be able to understand. And then with whatever words you do know, can you put those into at least enough of a framework that somebody else can understand the message? So for instance, when you are first starting, you are not going to be able to stream sentences together very well. And that's okay. You caveman speak it until that idea gets across. And if the context is clear enough, the native speaker will be able to guess what you're talking about. That's how babies learn how to speak. And we don't worry about the grammar until after we've had the message got figured out. Then the parent's like, oh, is this what you meant to say? And you say, yes, that's what I meant to say. A lot of times, the way that you unlock those next levels in your language development, in your story, is you actually try and communicate, because it's just a system of communication. So I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I served a mission in Taiwan. That's where I learned how to speak Mandarin Chinese. I learned because it was required to be able to do the job that I was there to do.
That's what I was going to point out. It's like, because that makes sense, because they say, you know, the best way to learn a language is to be able to speak nothing but it, you know, so by being there, what are you going to do? And you're right. Then you get the context that you're talking about.
Right. And when you are stepping into everyone else's normal, you're like, oh, I can learn how to do this. I did have a lot of experiences in Taiwan where I met expatriates that were not willing to even try and speak the language, though. So immersion does not guarantee that you're going to learn the language. It doesn't. Like, how many Spanish speakers have you guys ran into in your life that they've lived in America their whole life, but they still don't speak English? A lot of people.
Yeah,
because it's uncomfortable. They are stepping out of their norm into somebody else's norm. But one of the things I noticed is when you are willing to look silly for a moment to try and communicate, native speakers are so grateful, because you're taking the pressure off of them and you are giving them an opportunity to help you. And have you ever heard of the Benjamin Franklin effect? You heard this before?
I don't think so. Have you, Jason?
Okay,
no, I've not.
Here's the idea. Benjamin Franklin, he was really good at creating enemies in politics, and he found out that if he asked for a favor, he could create relationships from even his enemies. So he would go and ask other people that he had kind of contention with, and he'd ask them, he's like, hey, you're so good at X, Y, or Z. Would you be willing to help me do this? And they'd be like, wow, you're coming to me? Yeah, absolutely. And the very fact that he asked for a favor from an enemy turned it into a friend. So in language learning, if you are willing to ask for a favor, you can actually have somebody become an advocate for you to learn. And one of my favorite things to do, you can literally do this in any word, with any word that you learn in any language. You take that word and you find a native speaker and you can say, hey, did you know I just learned this word? How do you use it? You just use that word twice. Like, random word. You'd be like, phospholipid bilayer. It literally could be any word that you could think of. You're like, hey, I learned this word.
Right.
It's kind of a weird word, phospholipid bilayer. Yeah, that is weird. How do you use that? Or do you use that? And you integrate that word into your language and you create a moment, anytime you can utilize that word or that phrase, it makes it stick because now you have an experience with that word. I've got a story for you. This is one that was one of my favorite mistakes that I ever made as a missionary. You ready for this? I was learning the word for banana, okay, xiangjiao, which is banana. And I was like, I'm gonna use this today. So I go into our little local grocery store there. I'm like, ching ching. It's like, that's not racist, that's just the bell. But I walk in and there's only one person that's in there, and it's this beautiful Taiwanese girl. She's probably 20 years old, really pretty. My companion and I in our mission, we had to stand right next to each other to be able to talk to girls, because that was just one of the things. It's like, hey, 你们有 Xingjiao ma? Do you guys have Xingjiao? And she looked at me stunned. She's like, excuse me? It's like, yeah, 我要 Xingjiao. It's like, I want Xingjiao. And my companion looks at me. He's like, do you know what you just said? And I was like, I want a banana. Do you have banana? And
oh my God.
He's like, no, you said, do you want sexual intercourse? And I was like, whoa, no, I did not want that. I'm sorry, I did not want that. That's not what I meant to say. And the thing is, I didn't have a good enough language to be able to like gesture what I meant. So I just left. Ching ching. And it was so embarrassing.
That's fantastic.
But I never forgot that word. Never forgot that word.
I
again.
bet.
Yeah.
I think what I can
funny story.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, and when you have that type of an experience, even though it was very embarrassing, it creates and cements that word into your head because now it means something. Right. It wasn't just random words. Okay, go ahead, Jason.
I think linguistics and conceptualize is the two words that come to mind when you're hearing that, because the definition of a good storyteller is I felt like I was at that store with you for that short time. Mm-hmm. And we've captured that in the sports. Tell us about the popcorn as a guy smoking a cigar out before you go in, etc. So when you get satisfaction out of doing this, because man, this is a master's level course. The thing that's so cool about your answers that you're giving us the 100 basic stuff and the master's level stuff, and you're just mixing it in there so eloquently there. Who do you get the most excitement of? Is it a child that you're trying to shape a positive future and make them laugh a little bit? Is it maybe the adult? Like I'm going to just kind of let you take that any direction, because I think your audience is my family has about 100 years in education sector, and I'm very proud of that. So I can see that you're a teacher. I would want to learn from you either at a master's level or if I was still younger. Talk to me a little bit about the audience that you really vibe with the most, you think, and quite frankly, you enjoy yourself the most.
I love that you gave me this opportunity. Any audience that I'm in front of is my favorite audience. My next audience is my favorite audience. The reason why is they're diverse. And sometimes I want to talk to little kids and give them the opportunity to have those eyes get really big. Like, for instance, last week I got the opportunity to read one of my favorite stories to a group of our kids. We have a little group called TFP Kids, the Final Percent Network Kids. There's about 20 kids there. I read Max Licado's You Are Special, if you're familiar with that story. It's a story about these little Wemmicks, these people that are like puppets, like little wooden people, and they put dots or stars on each other depending on whether or not they're good or they're bad and how they're perceived. And it's this judgment thing. And there's this little Wemmick who he really wanted to be a good Wemmick or a good wooden person, but he kept falling and scratching his paint, and he would get these dots. And he would try and do different things, and he would get dots. And then one day he met somebody, her name was Lucia, and she didn't have any dots or stars. And that was really weird because all of the Wemmicks, these little people, had these little judgment marks from everybody. He's like, how did you not have any dots or stars? And she said, well, I go see the wood carver, Eli, he the creator. I go see him all the time. And he's like, well, can I go meet him? He's like, yeah. So he got a little scared. He goes home and he's like, I don't know if I could do this, but he finally decides to go and see Eli, and he goes and walks all the way up to the top of the hill. He's really apprehensive. He opens the door and he looking around, and the big voice says, come on in, basically. Like, what? Punchinello, that's his name. He said, Punchinello. He's like, you know my name? He's like, of course I know you. You were mine. I made you. And he's like, wow. the wood carver, even he knows me. He says, looks like you haven't had very many good marks. What's going on there? And he said, yeah, I'm not a very good Wemmick. He's like, what are you talking about? You're mine. You're very special. It doesn't matter what they think. It matters only what I think. And at the very end, after Punchinello starts to believe that Eli actually does love him, despite what other people say, one of his little dots falls off and doesn't stick to him. He says the only way that those dots don't stick to you is if you don't let them stick to you. You don't care what other people think. And I was like, that's such a beautiful message. And seeing those little kids' eyes light up, like, oh, I don't have to let other people's judgments, other people's remarks about me stick to me. I can choose the things that I care about. And I just thought it was a beautiful little story. So
yeah, I love that. That's great.
Go ahead, Nick.
Go ahead.
How much do you? First of all, do you have a psychology background? Like, do you
I
any
love
studying
psychology.
Of psychology.
I studied psychology for
Okay.
the purpose of learning how to be an actor.
Okay,
So
I figured that was somewhere in the
I can
background
see that.
because I mean, I want to talk about the psychology aspect of storytelling just a little bit. I mean,
For sure.
It's such a huge part. Even you were talking about like asking someone for a favor. You know, like if I remember, in fact, Jason probably knows more than me because he's more the sales guy. But like, I'm pretty sure that's kind of a tactic that the old school like door-to-door salespeople would use. Is they would say, "Can I have a glass of water?" You know, and they didn't ask for the glass of water because they were thirsty. It was because like once someone gave them that glass of water, there was instantly some kind of a relationship there. You know, like you did a favor for that person. So, you know, you're telling yourself, well, I'm not going to do a favor for someone that I don't like. So that instantly gives some kind of rapport, you know, right there between the salesperson and the prospect, right? So I guess I kind of went off on a tangent, but just saying that, like with your storytelling background, how important is psychology behind all of that, and how much of a part does that play in the whole process?
Oh, the psychology of storytelling. This might be a little longer answer, but
It's okay.
Let's start with this. There was a study done years ago where these people came and they said, all right, we want to figure out how we can get some slow down traffic signs that are kind of big into people's yards and have them be okay with us putting them there. So they kind of did this split study, and they said, well, would you be willing to put this little card in your window? It's basically like, hey, slow down, don't drive fast. Most of the people that they knocked on the window and they said, hey, will you take this tiny little card and put it in your window? They said, yeah, that's a small little commitment. I'm fine with that. And then a few weeks later, they came back and they said, hey, can we put this big sign that's basically said the same thing in your lawn? Can we do that? Is that fine? And because they had that commitment earlier, that was a yes, they said, yeah, you can do that.
At the bridge.
They did the same thing starting with the big sign in another neighborhood, and almost everybody said, no, I don't want that big sign in my yard. And it starts with that permission. If you have a small win, it is a way that you can start to build rapport. Let's talk about how that applies to storytelling. If you are able to get a hook or a framework that people are bought into, as soon as they say, oh, I'm interested in this story, that small little hook, that lean in, that gives you permission to go and expand on the backstory. It gives you permission to go and expound the conflict and the difficulty of what's going on with those characters. But if you don't have them in the first minute or two hooked with that inciting incident and say, oh, wow, this is a really big problem, you will want to stay to the very end because it hopefully will be solved, but if not, the whole world's going to come to a stop or whatever. The higher those stakes are, the bigger it is for those people to psychologically have to see it. Here's a way that you'll see this on social media with their storytelling. They will give you a 1 to 3 second hook and say, hey, stay to the end to make sure that you know what happens to this. And then they'll start at the beginning of the story. Anytime you have a forward, this is getting to that higher level thing, but it's basically you will have something pop up at the beginning of a story that at the end of the story will have to come back. For instance, in Harry Potter, you guys familiar with Harry Potter? Is this hopefully this is an okay reference. In Harry Potter, you have the golden snitch, not stitch, the golden snitch. It gets caught in Harry's mouth, right? And later on, this is going to be spoiler alert if you've never seen this, but it says, I open at the close. And they're like, what the heck? He gets this given back to him later on, like literally books later, he gets the golden stitch back from Dumbledore. And it has an incantation that if he touches it, it's supposed to open. And the Minister of Magic's there waiting for it to open, and it doesn't open. He's like, what the heck? Why didn't that work? Whatever. And he leaves. And then Harry plops it and gives it a kiss, and it opens up later on in the story because it wasn't his hand that caught it, it was his mouth. He caught the stitch with his mouth. Those little anchoring ideas that come and get payoff later, those closed loops, that's one of the ways that you hook an audience in and make them appreciate the entire arc of a story. This is something that happens in almost all good storytelling. You will have a lot of dominoes get set up early on in the show, and then later on, something will push that domino. And because you saw them all get set up, you'll know, oh, this fell, so now this is going to fall, and now that's going to fall, and bam, this is what happens. So the psychology of this, if you understand where you want to go in a story and you craft the story in such a way that you let the audience in on the secret, you let them know what to expect, you help them see that domino get set up. When it gets pushed by somebody, they get to enjoy the entire process. Here's a concrete example. If you've ever seen Home Alone, Macaulay Culkin, he sets up all of these little traps for the burglars that are going to try and come and steal stuff from him. They have like nails in the floor, glue, and they have tons of broken ornaments and like a bowling ball at the top of the stairs. And all of these different things that you're like, oh, I can't wait till those guys get in there because I want to see every single one of these booby traps come to fruition.
Yeah.
Every time you set that trap, you are creating anticipation for your audience, and the chances of them leaving when you build that anticipation, that psychology is so important. If there's no anticipation, if they don't care what happens, they might as well leave the theater and not pay attention. They might as well not interact with your advertisement or your marketing. But if you can help them build that anticipation and be like, oh, what is going to happen? And they get on the end of their seat and they lean in, like, oh, I have to see this. And then you go to commercial break, you're like, oh, I need to see that. One of the other things with psychology is I'm sure you've heard of the term a cliffhanger, right? We're not talking about a booger. We're talking about like at the end of a story.
Yeah.
Anytime you cut that action off before it's completely finished, you build anticipation. You'll notice this with a lot of television series. They'll leave it open-ended. They'll leave it with just enough, I wonder, that your audience wants to come back and see what happens next. If you don't have a what's happens next and it's all completely tied up, there's no extra story and they're going to just go on with their life. But if you build enough anticipation and you tie one story to the next story, suddenly they are invested in the characters, they're invested in you, they're invested in your business, and all those things come to fruition when you have that last domino fall. And when that falls and they knew it was set up, it feels good. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just real quick, the theme of the Mosaic kind of merges stuff together. So just to throw this out there, I'm going to merge sport, real estate, storytelling with you. I'm going to throw you a little bit of fork in the road, but you're going to handle it. Talk to us a little bit about how you sharpen your skills at the Toastmasters, because I know your storytelling there, your public speaking there. Talk to the general audience and do this. Tell a vibrant story so Nick and I are convinced to go to our local meeting just to kind of
we've been talking about
break
it
that
forever.
ice. I don't want to say pitch us, but give us a story of how that's inspired you and increased your craft, because I can tell you take pride in your craft and you're always wanting to get better. You're not a stagnant person.
Yes, so
go ahead.
This brings up one of my favorite quotes in Chinese, Bu Jin Ze Tui. If you're not progressing, you're digressing. Just like in theater, your last show is the one that people remember. in storytelling, the last story that you told, that's the one that people remember. One of the reasons I like Toastmasters, and I like a lot of different types of personal development. Toastmasters is just one, so it's not something that is exclusive. There are lots of ways you can do it, but I personally choose Toastmasters because they have a very simple program and it's tailored to what you want to do. They have some specific skills, and then you take those skills and apply it to your story. It's not, you have to talk about this specific element only. No, you come up with your stories, your topics, and they say, here's a few different ways you can fill it out and use this to polish your story.
We hope you've enjoyed learning how to tap into the power of storytelling and how it can level up both your personal and professional life. Don't worry, this journey doesn't end here. Join us next week for part 2, where we dive even deeper into practical strategies for mastering your story and amplifying your impact. You won't want to miss this. Be sure to check out Brigham's social media and his Levelin Up Podcast to stay connected with everything he's doing. We'll have all of that listed in the show notes. And remember, if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave us a review. Help us spread the word so more people can unlock their full potential.